The night the world tuned and began like any other broadcast. The CNN headquarters glowed against the Manhattan skyline, its crimson logo flickering across glass walls polished to mirror perfection. Inside, technicians adjusted sound levels, cameras hummed softly, and a quiet tension rippled through the air, that unmistakable electricity that precedes something historic. Anderson Cooper sat alone at his desk, reviewing his cards one last time. Calm, composed, unflappable, he was the portrait of discipline. Every gesture deliberate, every word measured. Across decades of journalism, he'd faced generals, presidents, whistleblowers, men and women who wielded power, fear, and deception. Yet tonight felt different. Tonight wasn't politics. It was personality. The guest waiting backstage wasn't a politician or scandal-ridden CEO. She was a cultural fault line in human form. Meghan Markle, Duchess, actress, activist, lightning rod of global opinion. Some saw her as a survivor of an antiquated monarchy. Others, as its loudest critic. But no one, on either side of the ocean, saw her as small. The countdown began. 10, 9. The lights shifted from soft white to broadcast gold. 8, 7. Camera 2 zoomed into Anderson's signature silver hair and composed eyes. 6, 5. The floor manager whispered, "Showtime." 4, 3, 2. "Good evening," Anderson began, his voice smooth but carrying that subtle steel that always came before the storm. "Tonight, a conversation many have waited for, and some would rather avoid. Meghan Markle joins me in studio." Applause echoed across the room, polite but charged. Every clap carried curiosity, skepticism, judgment. And then she appeared. Meghan stepped from the shadows into the warm glare of the studio lights. Dressed in emerald silk, her posture was regal, chin slightly raised, shoulders back, every movement deliberate. The crowd stilled, cameras locking onto her like gravity itself had shifted. She smiled, that media-perfect smile honed from years of red carpets and magazine covers. But under the lights, even perfection begins to tremble. "Meghan, welcome," Anderson said, standing to greet her. "Thank you, Anderson," she replied, tones silky but edged. "It's refreshing to speak with a journalist who does his homework." It was phrased as praise. It sounded like provocation. The host smiled faintly, gesturing for her to sit. The two figures, the journalist and the royal renegade, faced each other across a sleek glass table. Between them lay more than cue cards. It was tension, reputation, and a question older than fame itself. What happens when image meets truth? The first question was gentle, deceptively so. "How are you and Harry adjusting to life away from the palace?" Meghan crossed her legs slowly, fingers interlaced in her lap. "We're thriving," she said with conviction. "Our lives are finally our own. Free from constraints, free from control." Anderson nodded. "That's good to hear. Though some reports suggest otherwise, that Prince Harry finds it difficult being away from his family." She laughed, light, polished, brittle. "Do you really want to waste your time repeating tabloid gossip, Anderson?" The laughter in the studio dimmed quickly. Her tone wasn't playful, it was a reprimand. Anderson didn't flinch. "Not gossip, context. Many are curious about how the two of you navigate that transition. It's fair to ask, isn't it?" Meghan's smile returned, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. "We don't navigate, Anderson. We lead. And if people can't understand that, perhaps they should stop projecting their unhappiness onto us." It was elegant, sharp, dismissive. Anderson leaned forward slightly, fingers brushing the edge of his notecards. "Then let's talk about leadership. You've spoken often about the challenges within the royal family, feeling unsupported, silenced. But since stepping away, you've built an extraordinary platform. Streaming deals, publishing contracts, public speeches. Critics argue you've monetised the very institution you condemn. How do you respond to that?" Her eyes flickered. "I respond by saying I survived. And I don't apologize for surviving." Her voice hit the word survived with precision, as though scripted. Anderson's gaze didn't waver. "You weren't powerless, though. You had influence, opportunity, and influence, she interrupted. Influence isn't protection. Fame isn't freedom. People think success shields you. It doesn't. It magnifies the attack. A hush rolled through the audience. Even those who doubted her leaned in now. Anderson allowed the silence to breathe before speaking again, softer this time. You said once that you wanted peace. Yet here you are, again, telling your story on one of the world's biggest platforms. Isn't that contradictory? Her voice sharpened. It's not contradiction. It's control. We choose when and how to speak. That's our right. Of course, Anderson said calmly. But you can't ask for privacy while living in the spotlight. That's not how public life works. The words sliced cleanly. No malice. No emotion. Just fact. Meghan tilted her head. Public life, she echoed, tone tightening. You mean the same kind of life where men like you get to decide how women should behave? The crowd inhaled collectively. The temperature in the studio dropped. Anderson didn't flinch. This isn't about gender, Meghan. It's about accountability. There's a difference. Her reply came quick, almost reflexive. Accountable to whom? To people who never met me. To journalists who twist every word. He met her glare with unbroken calm. Accountable to truth. The silence that followed was suffocating. Cameras captured the flicker of something unspoken. Anger, frustration, fear. The interview had only begun, but the balance of power was already shifting. Narration would later describe it like this. What began as conversation had turned into chess. Every question was a calculated move. Every answer, a counterattack. Anderson Cooper, the master of composure, had drawn first blood, not through confrontation, but through calm precision. Meghan adjusted her posture, inhaling deeply. Her charm returned, but her eyes gave her away. They darted briefly toward the camera, as if to remind herself who she was, or who she wanted to be seen as. He continued, You've spoken often about the press twisting your words, yet you've chosen to tell your story repeatedly, in documentaries, interviews, podcasts. Some would say you've created your own media empire. Isn't that the very spotlight you once rejected? Her jaw tightened. We didn't reject the spotlight, Anderson. We rejected exploitation. Is there a difference? Yes, she said sharply. The difference is consent. The difference is control. Her tone was clipped, defensive, like a soldier cornered by her own rhetoric. Anderson nodded slowly, never looking away. Control is powerful, but truth doesn't always obey it. The studio was silent again. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as though unwilling to intrude. Meghan uncrossed her legs, leaning slightly forward. Her tone softened just enough to mask irritation. Anderson, you've built a career asking hard questions. I respect that. But understand this. No one who's lived what I have owes anyone an explanation. Anderson's reply was gentle, but final. And yet here you are, offering one. Her eyes flickered downward. For the first time that night, she didn't have an immediate retort. The crowd felt it. That invisible tremor when pride meets truth. The narration could have ended there, a perfect cinematic beat, but something deeper hung in the air. Both knew this was no longer just an interview. It was a reckoning between narrative and fact, between performance and authenticity. And as the cameras zoomed in, the lights reflected off the glass table between them. Two worlds, mirrored but never meeting. And somewhere behind the lens, a producer whispered what everyone watching already knew. This is no interview anymore. It's history. The opening warmth had drained from the studio like light retreating before a storm. What began as civility now pulsed with tension. Each exchange between Anderson Cooper and Meghan Markle carried more heat, more precision, more danger. The CNN logo gleamed behind them in crimson, almost prophetic, two shades of red, passion and warning. Anderson sat perfectly still, one hand resting on his notes. He hadn't raised his voice once, yet he was winning. His calm had weight. Meghan's poise, meanwhile, had begun to fray in imperceptible ways. The slight tremor of a leg, the forced smile after each answer, the controlled breaths between barbed sentences. The next question landed softly, too softly. Meghan, Anderson said, You've often spoken about independence, about stepping away from an institution that you say silenced you. But since leaving, you've been more visible than ever. Documentaries, interviews, podcasts, deals. Some might call that contradiction. A ripple ran through the audience. The word hung like perfume and smoke. Subtle, intoxicating, dangerous. Meghan's laugh was light but hollow. That's not contradiction, Anderson. That's reclaiming narrative. There's a difference between being silenced and choosing to speak. Anderson nodded once. Fair. But when every word is amplified to millions, doesn't that make the silence louder? Her gaze sharpened. You think because I speak, I owe every part of myself to the public? That's not how this works. I choose what I share. He didn't blink. And that choice, does it still count when the story's built on the same institution you walked away from? The audience shifted. Even those watching at home could feel the thin layer of composure stretching. She leaned forward slightly. You're implying I've exploited my experience. That's false. I've used my voice to highlight injustice. Anderson's tone didn't change. And to sell it. The air snapped. Even the camera operator hesitated before zooming closer. Excuse me, she said, voice rising. He met her gaze evenly. When pain becomes product, it's worth asking where truth ends and marketing begins. The audience gasped softly. The tension between empathy and exposure crackled. Meghan straightened in her chair. You think this is about money? Anderson's reply was surgical. I think this is about ownership. Who controls the story? You? Or the image you've built? She crossed her arms now. So you're saying I'm fake? I'm saying, Anderson replied quietly, that authenticity doesn't need a camera. The audience erupted in murmurs, the band's instruments glinting in stillness. For a second, even the technicians forgot to breathe. Meghan inhaled deeply, her tone sharpening into something colder. You know, Anderson, people like you love to dissect women, especially women who dare to speak. Every time I tell my story, someone like you calls it self-promotion. When a man does it, it's bravery. Anderson's gaze didn't waver. I don't care about gender, Meghan. I care about consistency. That word, consistency, landed harder than any accusation. He continued, calm and relentless. You've spoken about pain, betrayal, and the need for peace. But pain can't coexist with constant exposure. You don't get to step off the stage if you keep building bigger ones. Her jaw tightened. I'm using my platform to make change. He nodded. And I'm using mine to ask if the platform became the goal. For a moment, no one moved. The hum of the studio lights sounded like thunder. Her tone dropped an octave, quiet but furious. You don't understand what it's like to have every part of your life picked apart, judged, mocked. Anderson's expression softened slightly. You're right, I don't. But I do understand what it looks like when someone turns that scrutiny into a strategy. The audience exhaled as one. They were witnessing something raw, unpolished, the rare collision of self-perception and truth. Narration would later describe it perfectly. There are interviews that inform. There are interviews that entertain. And then there are interviews that expose. And this one was about to do all three. Anderson flipped his next card without looking at it. Let's talk about Harry. Her shoulders stiffened. He's spoken of the toll, losing titles, traditions, his family. Many wonder if, in protecting your happiness, he's lost his own. Her head tilted sharply. You're insinuating I took something from him. I'm asking, Anderson said gently, if love cost him more than it gave him. She let out a laugh, short and sharp. That's insulting. He's never been happier. Anderson leaned forward. Happier or isolated? The audience gasped again, softer this time. It wasn't shock anymore. It was anticipation. Meghan's tone rose, defensive now. Do you think he's some fragile child who can't make his own decisions? Anderson's reply was calm but cutting. I think he's a man who traded legacy for loyalty, and I'm asking if he knew the full price. Her jaw clenched. We built our life together. We walked away to protect our family. He nodded. And yet, you keep walking back into the spotlight you claim to escape. That was the turning point. The line that cracked her composure. "You're twisting this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You're turning our choices into spectacle." Anderson's tone stayed smooth, quiet, impossible to argue with. "I don't have to twist anything, Meghan. You've already told the story, again and again. All I'm doing is listening." A few audience members applauded. The sound felt out of place, reverent, almost nervous. Meghan leaned back, folding her arms tightly across her chest. "You know what, Anderson? I thought CNN was above tabloid tactics. And I thought accountability wasn't optional," he replied. The silence between them stretched, vibrating with restrained emotion. Two professionals, both masters of media, locked in a standoff no producer could have scripted. She forced a smile. "You're very good at making people uncomfortable, aren't you?" He returned it, only when comfort hides contradiction. Her expression froze, calm above the surface, turmoil beneath. Narration might have captured it this way. Anderson Cooper didn't break her with volume. He broke her with stillness. Every pause was a mirror. Every silence, a verdict. Behind the cameras, the producers exchanged looks, equal parts terror and awe. This wasn't the interview they expected. It was better. Anderson turned his notes over, unread. "You've said many times that you're misunderstood. Tonight was your chance to change that." Her eyes flickered. "And what do you think I've done?" He paused, his voice soft but loaded. "You reminded people why perception isn't the enemy. It's the reflection." That landed harder than any accusation. The audience sat motionless, captivated, unsure whether they were witnessing journalism or psychological dissection. Meghan straightened, her jaw trembling ever so slightly. She forced another smile, brittle, fragile, the kind you wear when you know the battle isn't going your way. Anderson leaned back, folding his hands. "Let's take a short break," he said finally. The music cue didn't play right away. No one remembered to trigger it. The silence lingered a second too long. Heavy, meaningful, cinematic. As the screen faded to commercial, viewers everywhere realized something rare. They weren't watching an interview anymore. They were watching a mask slip, one sentence at a time. When the cameras came back from commercial, the studio didn't feel the same. The applause cue light blinked weakly, but the audience hesitated before clapping, as if they'd just returned to a scene of quiet wreckage. Anderson sat with his cards untouched, his posture still perfect, his calm expression hiding the scent of something electric in the air. Meghan, by contrast, seemed carved in glass. One wrong move, one wrong question, and everything might shatter. The next few seconds felt longer than the break itself. Anderson looked up from the desk, voice steady. "Before the break, you mentioned control, the right to speak on your own terms. I'd like to continue there." Meghan nodded slowly, her expression fixed. "Of course." Her tone was rehearsed again, smooth, courteous, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. Anderson leaned in slightly, fingers steepled. "You've often said that the royal institution failed you, emotionally, even spiritually. Yet many inside that same institution have remained silent despite the same pressures. Why do you think your story resonates more than theirs?" The audience stirred. It wasn't an attack. It was woes. It was curiosity that cornered. Meghan hesitated. "Because I dared to speak. Because I refused to be complicit." Anderson nodded slowly. "And what would you say to those who think you've replaced silence with spectacle?" Her eyes narrowed, voice rising half a note. "Spectacle? Is that what you think this is?" He didn't flinch. "It's what some see. A constant retelling, a rebranding of pain. I'm asking if you see that too." The room went still. "That's cruel," she said, her voice trembling. "You sit here acting as if I planned every trauma, every lie written about me." Anderson's tone softened. "I'm not questioning the pain. I'm questioning the profit." Her lips parted. The audience audibly gasped. "I can't believe you just said that." "I can't believe you're surprised," Anderson replied, voice like glass breaking under velvet. For the first time, Meghan broke eye contact. She adjusted the folds of her dress, staring briefly at the floor as if grounding herself. When she looked back up, her charm had vanished. "You know, Anderson," she began, People think interviews like this are fair. But they are not. They are traps. You ask questions designed to make me defensive, then call it accountability. Anderson's eyes flickered, calm but unreadable. I'm asking questions the world already has. I'm just giving you the space to answer them. She laughed, sharp and humorless. You're not giving me space. You're boxing me in. Sometimes, he said quietly, truth feels like a box when it's closing in. The audience exhaled audibly. It wasn't just journalism anymore. It was a duel in slow motion. Anderson looked down at his final card, then placed it face down on the desk. Let's be direct, he said. Without marrying into the royal family, would you be sitting here tonight? The question dropped like a hammer. Meghan froze, her smile gone completely. So that's what this is about, she whispered. It's about reality, Anderson replied. You were an actress with a steady career. Then you became a duchess. Since then, you've defined yourself by the monarchy you claim to reject. So I'll ask again. Without it, would the world be listening? Her voice cracked with disbelief. That's sexist, reductive, and insulting. It's factual, Anderson said. The audience murmured, their discomfort mixing with fascination. Meghan leaned forward now, anger burning behind the composure. I had a voice before Harry. I had success before Harry. I mattered before Harry. Anderson's tone didn't rise. But not like this. The platform you use to criticize the institution is the same one it built for you. You can't dismantle a ladder while standing on it. She inhaled sharply. You don't know what I've endured. You're right, he said softly. But I do know what endurance looks like. It doesn't sell streaming rights. The gasp from the crowd was immediate, collective. Even the band members exchanged glances. Her hands curled into fists on her lap. You think you're clever, she said through gritted teeth. Sitting there, poking at people's scars for entertainment. Anderson's expression hardened, the faintest edge entering his voice for the first time all night. I think truth matters more than comfort. Meghan's face flushed red. You're disgusting. I'm disciplined, he corrected calmly. There's a difference. That did it. The last veneer of calm shattered. Do you have any idea what it's like, she said, voice trembling, to have the entire world judge you for loving someone, to wake up every day to lies about your family? Anderson waited, then asked quietly, then why keep feeding the fire? Because silence is death, she snapped. He nodded slowly. Then perhaps peace was never what you wanted. The words landed like a strike. Even Meghan's jaw fell open slightly. You think this is peace? She said, voice shaking. Do you think any of this was easy? I gave up everything. My country, my freedom, my sanity, for love. Anderson's gaze softened, but his tone stayed precise. And maybe that's where the story ends. Love redefined as loss. The silence stretched into infinity. You could hear a pin drop. Then Meghan's voice cut through the quiet. Lower now, dangerous. You're going to regret this interview, Anderson. He didn't blink. If asking questions is regret, then I'll live with it. She pushed back in her chair, fury etched across her face. You don't get to decide how my story is told. He leaned forward, calm but final, then stopped turning it into a sequel. The audience gasped again, that sound that lives between awe and fear. Meghan stood suddenly, the microphone wire pulling taut. Her breathing was audible now, ragged. You're unbelievable. Anderson adjusted his jacket, still seated, still composed. No, just consistent. The camera operators froze, unsure whether to follow her or stay on Anderson. This interview, she said, is over. He nodded once. I think the audience just reached the same conclusion. The words hung like smoke. Meghan turned sharply, tearing off her mic. The sound crackled in every speaker. As she stormed toward the stage exit, the room stayed silent. No applause, no music, just the echo of her heels striking the floor like a drumbeat of defeat. Anderson remained seated, eyes following her until the door closed behind her. Then, and only then, did he exhale. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, not in laughter, but in stunned whispers. A moment frozen between disbelief and history. Anderson leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. Well, he said quietly into the microphone, still live. That was honest. Narration would later capture it like this. The moment Meghan Markle left that CNN stage, she wasn't walking away from Anderson Cooper. She was walking away from control. Because the truth she'd spent years curating had just met its first real test, and it didn't survive the interview. The door closed behind Meghan with a sharp, metallic click, a sound that echoed far longer than it should have. For a moment, no one moved. The studio lights hummed, the cameras froze, and Anderson Cooper sat perfectly still beneath the glow of CNN's red insignia. His expression was unreadable, calm on the outside, calculation behind the eyes. Across the control booth, a dozen producers erupted into motion. Headsets crackled, hands waved, instructions fired in every direction. Cut to logo. Do we have B-roll ready? Stay wide, don't zoom in. The director's voice cut through the chaos. Keep rolling. We might need this. Anderson glanced briefly toward the booth, then back to the empty seat across from him. Meghan's microphone cable still lay coiled on the floor like an unspoken apology. A faint smudge from her heel streaked the polished set tile, the last trace of a royal exit no one saw coming. He adjusted his cuffs, took a single breath, and spoke into the live mic. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back. The camera faded to black, but the silence beyond the lens was thunderous. Within minutes, the footage had been clipped, uploaded, dissected. Across social media, hashtags flared like sparks on dry leaves. #Markle meltdown, #Anderson unfiltered, #CNN clash. Each platform became its own courtroom. Every pause, every glare, every flicker of breath replayed and reinterpreted through the prism of loyalty and outrage. Clips looped endlessly, Meghan's words sliced mid-sentence, Anderson's measured retorts cut for dramatic effect. Commentators filled in gaps the footage never showed. She was ambushed, some cried. She showed her true face, others countered. Within an hour, newsrooms across the world scrambled to re-edit their primetime schedules. British morning shows framed it as vindication. The Duchess finally faces hard questions. American tabloids splashed headlines that bled scandal. Meghan walks out on CNN. Cooper left speechless. The palace issued no comment. They didn't have to. Their silence was a statement in itself. Inside CNN's newsroom, the mood was uneasy triumph. Executives huddled behind closed doors, whispering in crisis tones disguised as strategy. One producer typed frantically, "We're trending #1 worldwide." Another muttered, "For the right reasons." No one answered. Down the hall, Anderson sat alone in the editing suite, reviewing playback. He wasn't smiling. He rarely did after interviews like this. The adrenaline that powered the exchange had faded, leaving only quiet gravity, the kind journalists recognize after crossing the invisible line between inquiry and revelation. He watched the moment again, the question, her reaction, the silence that followed. Frame by frame. He'd done his job. He'd asked what needed asking. But even he couldn't ignore the feeling that something seismic had shifted, not just in the studio, but in the public's perception of truth itself. Outside, paparazzi had already swarmed CNN's glass front. Dozens of flashbulbs burst against the Manhattan night as Meghan's black SUV sped away from the parking bay, tinted windows reflecting chaos like a mirror. Inside the vehicle, she sat motionless. The silence in the car felt heavier than Anderson's questions. Her assistant, seated beside her, scrolled through Twitter in horror. "It's everywhere already," she whispered. Meghan didn't respond. She stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on the city lights passing in streaks. The composure she'd fought to maintain on air had finally cracked. Her reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. Not the global figure of poise and control, but a woman cornered by her own narrative. Her phone buzzed. A message flashed on the screen. "Harry, saw the clip. Call me." She didn't. Not yet. By morning, the fallout was impossible to contain. Major outlets ran side-by-side headlines. The Guardian, Anderson Cooper challenges royal narrative intense CNN exchange. Daily Mail, Meghan storms out, the moment her composure finally cracked. New York Times, a conversation about image, power, and truth. Commentators debated ethics. Was Anderson too harsh, or was he simply doing what few dared, holding fame to the same standard as power? On talk radio, hosts speculated on whether Meghan's career could recover. People will see this for what it is, one analyst said. A turning point, the moment the public stopped seeing her as victim and started seeing her as architect. But not everyone agreed. In Los Angeles, fans organized under the banner #Stand with Meghan, claiming she was bullied on air and targeted for speaking truth. The culture war reignited overnight. Back in the CNN building, Anderson arrived before dawn. Reporters lined the hallway waiting to glimpse him, to catch a quote. He ignored them all. In the control room, he reviewed the final cut again, not out of pride, but precision. Every frame, every silence mattered. Journalism, he knew, was a mirror that sometimes cracked the image it reflected. At 7 a.m., he walked onto the newsroom floor. "Are we airing the uncut version?" a producer asked. "Yes," Anderson replied. "Transparency is not optional." The broadcast replayed that morning across every screen in America. No edits, no filters, just two people, one question, and a silence that changed everything. Meghan's team issued a statement just before noon. Polished, professional, unrepentant. The Duchess of Sussex participated in what she believed would be a respectful conversation. She will not tolerate being misrepresented or attacked under the guise of journalism. The statement ignited another wave of headlines. CNN refused to comment further, standing firmly by Anderson. The network's official line was short, almost clinical. Mr. Cooper conducted a fair and balanced interview consistent with CNN's editorial standards. But within the corridors of news and royalty alike, everyone knew what that really meant. Neither side was backing down. That evening, Anderson returned home to his Manhattan apartment. He dropped his jacket onto the sofa and stood by the window overlooking the city. In the glass reflection, the lights of Times Square shimmered, every screen flashing a different version of the same story. He wasn't thinking about ratings, or applause, or backlash. He was thinking about that moment when she'd said, "You're going to regret this." He hadn't, not yet, but the echo of her voice lingered, part threat, part prophecy. Meanwhile, across the ocean, royal commentators filled late-night broadcasts with speculation. Some called the interview the final unraveling. Others said it was the moment truth fought back. In Buckingham Palace, silence remained their only statement. Behind its stone walls, an aide reportedly whispered, "For once, we didn't have to say a word." The next evening, Anderson opened his show with a rare moment of reflection. "Last night's interview has sparked intense debate," he began, eyes steady on the camera. "And that's the point of journalism, to ask, to listen, to challenge. Our role isn't comfort, it's clarity." He paused, letting the words settle. Truth doesn't belong to anyone. It only reveals who's willing to face it. The screen faded to black, and the world kept talking. In an era where interviews feel rehearsed and apologies are choreographed, the narrator would later summarize, this was something else entirely, a collision between myth and mirror. Two public figures, one moment of truth, and a silence that refused to die. By dawn on the second day, the interview had stopped being a broadcast and become a battlefield. Screens across 3 continents replayed the same moments on an endless loop. Meghan's glare, Anderson's stillness, the silence that cracked louder than any headline. The media didn't just report it. They dissected it, spliced it, re-weaponized it. The morning after, London's tabloids roared first. "Anderson destroys Duchess live on air," screamed one. Another countered, "Cooper's cruel cross-examination. Has CNN gone too far?" The contrast was deliberate, because division sells. By noon, British talk shows were frothing with commentary. Experts on body language pointed at the footage, freezing every flicker of Meghan's face like a criminal profile. "See the tightening of the jaw?" one analyst said. "That's anger masked as control." Another chimed in, "Anderson didn't break her. The truth did." But on American soil, the tone shifted. Los Angeles talk shows framed it as emotional ambush. America's Duchess disrespected on air, read the Chiron under a celebrity host's perfectly rehearsed outrage. Would Anderson Cooper have spoken that way to a male guest? They demanded, shaking their heads solemnly. Each side claimed truth. Each clip became a weapon. By afternoon, CNN headquarters was surrounded by camera crews from rival networks. Reporters stood under umbrellas as rain streaked down the plaza, their microphones trembling with static excitement. "Behind me," one correspondent said, "the fallout continues from last night's explosive confrontation between Anderson Cooper and Meghan Markle, an interview already being called the most polarizing of the decade." Inside, CNN's crisis room buzzed with phones and caffeine. "UK Parliament members are commenting now," a producer shouted. "Buckingham Palace still silent," another replied. The silence, ironically, made the story grow. In a glass-walled office upstairs, network executives debated strategy. One wanted to pull down the full clip, fearing lawsuits. Another leaned forward, eyes glinting. "Pull it. It's the most-watched segment in network history. This is journalism doing what it's supposed to, shaking power. Even if that power sues us. Especially if it does." Anderson's name dominated global hashtags. Overnight, he transformed from respected anchor to reluctant lightning rod. Editorials called him brave, cruel, incisive, insensitive, all at once. Anderson himself stayed quiet. He refused interviews, declined statements. He didn't need to defend the work. The footage spoke for itself. Across the Atlantic, Meghan's team huddled in a Beverly Hills mansion that smelled of coffee and panic. The table was cluttered with laptops, legal pads, and half-eaten croissants. A PR strategist paced the room. "Damage control. People. We're losing the narrative. By tomorrow, she's the villain unless we reframe this." Her assistant frowned. "What angle?" "The emotional one. She was attacked, ambushed, cornered. We position her as composed under cruelty. We emphasize resilience." Meghan sat silently at the head of the table, arms crossed. She hadn't slept. Her phone still buzzed every few seconds. Messages from friends, from lawyers, from Harry. "Do I release a statement?" she asked finally. The strategist nodded cautiously. "Yes, but not defensive. Reflective. Something that reminds the public who you are. Control the tone before the world defines it for you." She exhaled sharply, the exhaustion finally visible. "Fine. Draft something that sounds gracious but firm." Outside, a drone hovered above the property, its red light blinking like an unblinking eye. Back in London, royal aides were watching too. In the corridors of Buckingham Palace, televisions flickered with the CNN broadcast replay. A senior official sipped tea, expression unreadable. "She wanted a global platform," he murmured. "She has one now." Another advisor replied quietly. "It's no longer about her. It's about what she represents. Defiance without restraint." An internal memo circulated that afternoon. No comment regarding CNN segment. Maintain dignified silence. But off record, palace insiders were already whispering to journalists. Strategic leaks began within hours. Small, deliberate, devastating. "She knew exactly what she was walking into," said one unnamed source. "She was offered the questions in advance. She declined." The royal PR machine had awakened. By the third night, America's late-night talk shows turned it into a cultural spectacle. Clips of Anderson's question, "Would we be sitting here without Harry?" were replayed over applause tracks. Comedians mimicked Meghan's walk-off for laughs. The internet didn't forgive. A slowed-down video of her turning away from the camera, overlaid with dramatic music, racked up 20 million views in 6 hours. Caption, "When the interview gets too real." But beneath the viral noise, something deeper brewed, a global argument about media ethics, privilege, and power. Was this journalism's finest hour, or cruelty disguised as curiosity? Anderson's silence didn't last long. CNN's board demanded he respond. He agreed, but on his terms. No panel, no spin, just a statement. At precisely 7 p.m., the network cut to Anderson, live in studio. The camera framed him tightly, his tone solemn but firm. I've spent 20 years asking questions, he began. Tough ones, gentle ones, necessary ones. Last night's conversation was not about humiliation. It was about clarity. My job isn't to protect comfort, it's to pursue truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then. He paused, the silence deliberate. The questions I asked were fair. The answers, honest or not, belonged to the guest. That's journalism. That's all it ever was. No anger, no apology, just resolution. The clip was replayed across every news feed before midnight. Meanwhile, Meghan's statement dropped online at the same moment, a calculated duel of timing. When women speak their truth, they are too often labeled emotional or manipulative. Last night was a reminder of how far we still have to go. I stand by my words, my experiences, and my right to tell my story, without interruption, without distortion. The internet split instantly down the middle. #I support Meghan. #stand with Anderson. Each hashtag became a movement. YouTube commentators analyzed it frame by frame, monetizing outrage in real time. Podcasters built entire episodes around her tone of voice, his body language, the moment she looked away. Academics debated it in lecture halls. High schoolers argued about it in lunchrooms. The interview had transcended news. It had become myth. 3 days later, streaming services reported record spikes in viewership. CNN uploaded the full, unedited version, 2 hours long, including every second of silence. It trended #1 in 43 countries. Across every platform, one truth remained consistent. No one could stop watching. The world hadn't seen journalism like this in years. Stripped, raw, unyielding. And whether they loved or loathed her, everyone agreed on one thing. Meghan Markle had just faced something she couldn't control. In the age of filters and PR rehearsals, the narrator concluded, this interview didn't just shatter decorum. It redefined it. Because when truth and image collide, only one walks out of the studio. Weeks passed, but the interview refused to die. It lingered like an echo in the world's collective memory, not a news event, but a fault line. Clips replayed in classrooms, conference rooms, living rooms. Academics cited it in lectures about media power and celebrity psychology. Late-night comedians still referenced it in monologues. And through it all, both Anderson Cooper and Meghan Markle carried the weight of a conversation that had stopped being theirs the moment the cameras cut. The headlines had cooled, but the conversation hadn't. Every algorithm knew it. Every feed still fed on it. The moment had mutated from broadcast to symbol, a clash between truth and perception, empathy and ego, story and substance. For Anderson Cooper, life at CNN continued as usual, outwardly. But privately, something had changed. Viewers looked at him differently now. His questions carried more gravity, his silences more threat. When he walked through the newsroom, junior producers straightened instinctively. He'd become not just a journalist, but a benchmark, the man who faced a royal storm and didn't flinch. And yet, he didn't celebrate it. He never did. In his quiet apartment overlooking the Hudson, Anderson rewatched the interview one last time. He watched her words, her pauses, the flicker of pain that flashed between defiance and fragility. For a moment, he wondered if he had gone too far, not ethically, but humanly. Was it truth, he murmured to himself, or theater? He'd built a career on the idea that those two could coexist. But that night had tested the boundary, because what the world saw as victory, he sometimes saw as fracture, a line crossed, a person exposed too deeply for her own good. He turned off the screen, sat in silence, and did what only a few journalists still do. He questioned himself. Across the Atlantic, in Montecito, Meghan was still living in the shadow of that night. She'd expected outrage. She'd expected sympathy. But she hadn't expected exhaustion. Her team had spun the story. Her defenders had rallied online. But something irreversible had shifted. The once unshakable media charm around her was cracking. Invitations to talk shows dried up. A planned network special was quietly shelved. Her podcast producer called it creative reevaluation. Behind the polished facade of a mansion, Meghan walked through the house in silence, barefoot, phone in hand, scrolling through endless noise about herself. Each headline felt like a mirror, distorted, loud, merciless. At first, she tried to fight it. Statements, clarifications, controlled appearances. But each attempt only made the story grow. Eventually, she stopped trying to control it altogether. In the privacy of her garden, away from advisors and headlines, she sat one evening watching the California sun bleed orange into the horizon. For the first time in years, there were no cameras, no makeup, no angles. Just her, a fading light, and a question she couldn't escape. What if I became the very thing I fought? The thought lingered, painful, honest. But even in that quiet, another voice inside her refused surrender. The same one that had carried her from television sets to palace gates to global stages whispered, "You survived, Weiss." She wasn't done, but she was changed. Meanwhile, the world had moved on. Sort of. Universities began dissecting the interview in journalism courses. One professor called it a modern Frost and Nixon, except the monarch wasn't a king, but a narrative. Another described it as the night sincerity and branding finally divorced. In London, newspapers called Anderson's line, "Would we be here without Harry?" the quote of the decade. It entered public vernacular, used sarcastically in headlines, social posts, even comedy sketches. The palace remained silent, as always. But silence, too, can echo. Insiders claimed that within royal walls, the interview was watched privately, twice. One aide described it simply. They didn't gloat. They understood. By the first anniversary of the broadcast, CNN released a behind-the-scenes documentary titled The Moment. It chronicled the production, the fallout, the cultural shockwave that followed. But what caught audiences off guard wasn't the footage. It was Anderson's voiceover at the end. In it, he reflected softly, almost regretfully. Sometimes journalism reveals truth. Sometimes it reveals the person seeking it. I asked hard questions that night, but I learned that truth isn't always what you uncover. Sometimes it's what you can't control. The documentary trended again, proof that the world wasn't done watching either of them. A year later, Meghan Markle made her first major public appearance since the interview, not on a talk show, but at a university women's conference in New York. The room was packed, but not like before. The energy was quieter, cautious, curious. When she stepped onto the stage, there was no teleprompter, no entourage, just a podium and a microphone. She smiled, small, real, uncalculated. "People ask me if I regret that interview," she began. "Regret is a luxury you only get if you didn't mean what you said. I meant every word, but meaning doesn't make it easy." The crowd was silent. Then, slowly, they began to applaud. It wasn't thunderous. It was human. For the first time in a long time, so was she. As for Anderson, the legacy followed him, too. Whenever he sat down with a new guest, presidents, actors, scientists, there was an invisible question in every viewer's mind. Would he go that far again? He rarely did, but he never softened either. Because he understood something now. The real story isn't always in the answer. Sometimes, it's in the silence that follows. In a later interview for The Atlantic, he summarized it perfectly. "Meghan and I didn't clash. We collided. She brought her truth. I brought my questions. And somewhere between the two, the world saw itself." That's what journalism is, a mirror that breaks both ways. Years from now, people would still talk about that night, not because of the drama, but because it exposed something universal, our obsession with image, our fear of being seen without it. It wasn't a royal story. It wasn't a media story. It was a human one, a reminder that in the age of filters, authenticity isn't something you show, it's something you risk. And for one unforgettable hour on live television, two people risked everything. And in doing so, they made history.